Looking Out for Sampson, written by Libby Hathorn and illustrated by Anne James. Bronwyn liked Sampson a lot. At times she adored him. It was just that she wished he was more grown up. Then he could be more of a friend instead of a little brother who always needed looking after. Keep your eye on Sampson, Bronwyn. Where's Sampson, Bronnie? Are you looking out for Sampson, Bron? It seemed she spent most of her time looking out for Sampson, and sometimes that was hard going. I just wish there was someone around here my own age, Bronwyn said to no one in particular after Sampson had destroyed her model aeroplane for the third time. And then Cheryl and her mum, Deborah, came to stay for a while, and Cheryl was Bronwyn's own age, but Cheryl was awful. Cheryl was far worse than Sampson on a bad day. Be kind to Cheryl, Mum had said. She and Deborah are going through a very bad time and they need a bit of help while Deb sorts things out and looks for a flat. But Bronwyn soon found being kind to Cheryl was like being quiet with Sampson. It was just impossible. What a tiny little bedroom you have, Cheryl said when she arrived, dumping a battered suitcase in the middle of the floor. And such a tiny little window. No wonder it's so dark in here. At home, in my bedroom, I had great big glass doors that opened onto a huge garden with flowers and trees and 2 stone lions and a swimming pool. As Cheryl slowly inspected the room, Bronwyn was suddenly aware of its shabbiness. "Where's your TV then?" Cheryl asked when it seemed she'd taken in every detail of the small room. "I don't have a TV," Bronwyn said quietly. "You don't have a TV?" "I don't have a TV," Bronwyn repeated. "In fact, we don't own a TV at all." "Surely there must be one here," Cheryl laughed an unpleasant, tinkly laugh. "At home, I had my own video. Mum gave it to me as a surprise for Christmas. Or was it my birthday?" "Mum and Dad think kids are better off without TV. We only hire it in the holidays," Bronwyn said, staring at this intruder and forgetting oh so many fights she'd had with her parents over TV. "I agree with them, actually." "Do you? How unusual," Cheryl said with a fake smile. It was a drag having Cheryl in the house, and it was even more of a drag having to share her room. It was a drag having Cheryl's mum in the house as well. Mum and Dad seemed to be forever going off into little huddles with Deborah. Talk, talk, talk all the time, and every 5 minutes it seemed Deborah was boo-hooing all over the place. "Watch out for Sampson, will you, love?" Mum would say, disappearing into the bedroom with Deborah in tears yet again. "Your brother never lets up, does he?" Cheryl would say, lifting her head from the comic she was reading. "He does chatter such a lot." "And your mother does cry a lot," Bronwyn felt like saying, but she couldn't. Although she had decided very early in the piece that she hated Cheryl, she certainly didn't hate Cheryl's mum. In fact, she quite liked the pale, slender woman who would sit for hours with Sampson and delight him as she delighted Bronwyn herself, with quick, funny drawings she could make. It was a shame Cheryl's mum was so sad. "It must be very embarrassing for you, Bronwyn," Cheryl said one morning as she played dolls with Sampson, "that your little brother still wears nappies. You did say he was 2.5. "That's what I thought you said. Back home, my best friend Fiona's brother stopped wearing nappies at 1.5, but of course he's very clever. You should hear the words that child can say. He's amazing. No one could ever say that Fiona's brother was silly in any way. It really must be embarrassing for you." "Fancy your dad wearing an apron," Cheryl said that night as Dad chopped the celery, carrots and meat for dinner. "I mean, it does look a bit funny, a big man like that in a tiny little apron. It's great that he wants to do the cooking, but I must say it's very unusual about the apron." Bronwyn sighed and thought longingly about life before Cheryl. Nevertheless, it was a happy meal that night. Mum was telling some of her funny stories about the kids at play school, and Bronwyn was pleased to see Deborah really laugh at Mum's jokes. Go and play in the yard, you kids," Dad said, while it's still light. "Give Sampson a swing, will you, Bronnie?" Mum suggested. Bronwyn wished Cheryl had not followed her down the yard to the swing. She wished that she and Sampson could be left alone in the long, cool twilight, but Cheryl was at their heels. "Your mum talks very loudly, doesn't she? I noticed it first thing when we arrived. Very loudly when she gets excited." That was the first time Bronwyn felt like punching Cheryl very hard. It took a lot of control on Bronwyn's part to say nothing and to just keep pushing the swing. It was on Saturday afternoon that things really came to a head with Cheryl. Mum, Dad and Deborah were sprawled in the chairs after the barbecue enjoying the sun. Sampson was climbing over their feet being a dinosaur and generally annoying them. "Come and get Sampson, Bronwyn darling, and take him inside," Mum called lazily. Cheryl looked up with that funny smile on her face. Normally Bronwyn would have resisted Mum's request and said, "Oh no, not now, Mum." But somehow, with Cheryl sitting there gloating, she couldn't bring herself to ignore her mother, much less Sampson. She went outside to get the hot, busy little body smeared with butter and tomato sauce and smelling of sausage. She carried Sampson inside quickly, lightly, as if he were a prize. "Here you are, sweetheart," she said to him. "Let's make a great big tower." His chubby hands seized the bright plastic pieces of Lego. Cheryl came to stand and watch as Sampson's red and blue tower grew higher and higher. She yawned expansively. "It's very boring here, you know," she said, touching a Lego delicately with her foot. "Very boring and so hot. At home, we'd be swimming in our pool, and I'd have loads of friends over, and it'd be so cool and so lovely. Your yard is so small and so hot." She flicked a Lego piece with her toe, and it spun across the floor, the sharp corner unexpectedly stinging Bronwyn's knee. "Why don't you pack your bags then and go back to your pool and your glass doors and your stone lions if it's so great? Why don't you?" Bronwyn flashed, and she tossed the same Lego piece back across the floor. Cheryl meant to kick the Lego tower down, but her foot, lunging forward, made contact instead with Sampson's back. It probably didn't hurt much, but the surprise made him howl in protest. Bronwyn jumped to her feet and thumped Cheryl as hard as she could. Cheryl's howl was worse than Sampson's and brought the adults flying across the yard. "What on earth's going on?" Mum asked. "Bronwyn punched me so hard," Cheryl gasped. "Bronwyn!" Mum was shocked. "Why ever did you—" "I accidentally bumped Sam and then she hit me," Cheryl began, sobbing. "Oh, this is awful," Deborah began. "Sherry and I should pack and leave at once. It's nothing but trouble with us in the house." "Don't be silly, Deb," Dad comforted her. "It's only a kid's squabble. Let's forget it and go outside. Come on, Cheryl, dry your tears. Come on, Bron. All friends now?" And without waiting for an explanation, he wandered back into the yard with Sampson in his arms. Bronwyn sat alone among the Lego pieces. She thought bitterly of how she agreed with what Deborah had said, that they were nothing but trouble in the house. It annoyed her intensely that within a few minutes she could hear Cheryl's tinkling laughter outside, and it annoyed her even more when she glanced out the door to see Cheryl carrying Sampson in her arms in the direction of the swing, just as if he were her own brother. "Your dad cuddles Sampson's quite a lot, doesn't he?" Cheryl said that night as they lay in their beds in the dark. "And your mum does too." Bronwyn didn't answer. "It must be funny to have a brother so much younger than you. You don't seem to mind that your parents favour him." "What do you mean, favour?" Bronwyn asked, her heart giving a strange little thump. "Oh, you know, cuddle him and talk to him and spend loads of time with him and kind of ignore you. It doesn't seem to worry you one bit. It would worry me an awful lot." "Mum and Dad do spend time with me," Bronwyn protested. "It's just that since you've been here—" "Take tonight, for instance," Cheryl interrupted. "Now, I timed your mum in Sampson's room saying goodnight, and she was there for 12.5 minutes. Do you know how long she was in here saying goodnight to you? Exactly 30 seconds. I know you don't mind that sort of thing, but she's your mother too, and you're her kid. Of course, Sampson's very lovable." "I want to go to sleep, Cheryl," Bronwyn said coldly. "Will you be quiet?" Okay. You needn't get nasty just because I happen to notice things. But if you don't want to talk, I'll be quiet and you just go right off to sleep, Bronwyn." But Bronwyn didn't go right off to sleep at all. She lay wide awake in the darkness with Cheryl's words going over and over in her head. It was quite true that her parents spent a lot more time with Sampson than with her. But after all, he was a baby, well, a little kid, and it didn't necessarily mean that they loved him any more than they loved her. Or did it? Things had been different before Sampson came along. Bronwyn remembered how Mum used to talk to her for ages some nights. She always seemed too tired now. And she remembered how Dad had played cricket with her before Sampson came along. Now he didn't seem to have the time. Sampson kept the whole household revolving around him, but he was so lovable. Everyone thought so. Bronwyn wondered whether she was lovable anymore. She felt tears rising and had to choke them back. What Cheryl had said was true. Mum and Dad did spend more time with Sampson. All at once it seemed perfectly clear that they did love him better than her. Perhaps they didn't love her at all anymore. "You're very quiet this morning, Bronnie," Dad said, delivering the orange juice to the muddly breakfast table. Bronwyn had been watching Mum on the back step nursing Sampson, smothering his curly head with kisses as he squealed indignantly. Cheryl was sitting beside Mum on the step and had taken one of Sampson's dimpled hands. "He's such a sweetheart," she said, tickling the inside of his wrist with butterfly kisses. "I think he's terribly smart, you know." "Come and eat, everyone," Dad said. "You make the best eggs ever," Cheryl said, jumping up, "and I just adore that crazy apron of yours." Dad smiled at Cheryl. "Did Ron tell you we're spending the whole day at the beach today? We'll need to get moving early." "Wonderful," Cheryl said to Dad, "but later at out at the car, she said to Bronwyn, "The whole day at the beach, I hate the sand, you know, positively hate it, and I get absolutely bored with waves. They just keep coming and coming, and they make it so difficult to swim. Now a swimming pool's a different matter." "Well, there is a swimming pool at one end of the beach," Bronwyn said triumphantly. "Oh, but it's not a private pool, is it? I mean, there's nothing quite like your own private pool. I don't like public swimming baths with all those dirty little kids doing you-know-what in the water. Ugh." Cheryl dropped the basket and buckets in the boot of the car and stood back as Bronwyn closed it. "What kind of car is this?" she demanded. "Back home we have a Merc. It was air-conditioned. Brown cars are silly in this climate. They're so hot. Our Mercedes was silver grey with grey upholstery. It'll be such a long, hot drive with all of us in this brown car, and without air conditioning," she said. As Cheryl had predicted, it was a long, hot drive to the beach. "No trees," Cheryl observed flatly when Dad parked the car on the wide promenade that bordered the sandy beach. "We'll have the umbrella up for you in no time, Cheryl," Dad told her. "Too many people," Cheryl sniffed, peering critically at the bodies strewn over the sand. "I'll tell them to go home," Dad joked. "And all that sand," Cheryl said gloomily. "Sand?" Mum asked. "She doesn't like sand," Bronwyn explained. As they trailed down the beach, Dad said, "Let's dump our stuff here and take Cheryl to the baths. No sand there. Cement edges all the way around, and Sampson can have a paddle in the little rock pool below the baths." "I'd rather surf first," Bronwyn announced suddenly. "We'll be surfing all day, Bron," Mum said. "Let's go round to the baths first." It wasn't that Bronwyn minded the baths, it was that she minded all the fuss and bother about what Cheryl liked or disliked, wanted or didn't want. No one seemed to bother these days with what Bronwyn wanted or didn't want, and right now she wanted to surf with Mum and Dad and Sampson and forget about Cheryl and Deborah. But Dad insisted they swim in the baths first, so there was nothing for it but to follow the sweep of the beach around and show the pool, all edged in rough cement, to the girl who didn't like sand. Mum and Dad disappeared with Sampson down the slippery steps beside the baths that led to a shallow rock pool. Up above them at the baths, Bronwyn watched with envy as Cheryl executed a perfect dive and swam the full length of the pool. "I suppose Cheryl had a lot of practice back home at swimming and diving," Bronwyn said to Deborah. "Oh yes, a lot," Deborah said, side-stroking lazily through the water. "She swam practically every day in summer." "Was Cheryl's pool as big as this one?" "Well, it wasn't exactly Cheryl's pool, you know," Deborah laughed. "I mean the pool in your garden back home," Bronwyn insisted. "We didn't have a pool back home. We didn't even have a garden," Deborah laughed again. "Our flat was so small and hot. Having the park nearby and the municipal baths was great. We spent an awful lot of time at the baths and in the park." "The park with the stone lions?" Bronwyn asked. "Yes, it does have stone lions and gardens. Lovely, really. Did Cheryl tell you about it? In summer, we'd even take dinner down there and swim till quite late." "With all the other people?" Bronwyn asked. "Of course." They had paused at the side of the pool now, clinging onto the rough cement wall. Cheryl swam neatly through the water towards them, avoiding the bobbing bodies all around her. "I was just telling Bron about the municipal baths back home and how often we swam there on summer nights." "Ouch!" Cheryl cried out. "This stupid wall has sea urchins all over it, and I've collected one. I've got a whacking great spike in my toe." She lifted herself easily onto the concrete edge, pulling the dark spike from her big toe with delicacy. She held the splinter triumphantly, then glared down into the water at Bronwyn. "Back home," she said, "our municipal baths had lovely smooth-tiled walls and you couldn't possibly get spiked by sea urchins or anything." "That's because there's no sea," Deborah laughed. Mum and Dad were bringing an unwilling Sampson up the stairs. "Back to the beach," Mum told them. Sampson wailed all the way back and Cheryl protested too. "I'm burning hot, you know. Mum, are my shoulders red?" "We'll put some more suntan cream on if you like, but you're not burnt at all," Deborah assured Cheryl. "We'll build you a pond of your own, little boy, right in the shallows near our umbrella," Dad promised Sampson. Mum paddled with Sampson at the water's edge while Deborah and Dad wrestled with the umbrella. Cheryl placed her towel with extraordinary care so that not a speck of sand could be seen on it. "Watch out for Sampson, will you, Bron?" Mum said. "I'm going out the back. Coming, Deb?" Dad had already disappeared. "I want to go out the back to surf with Dad," Bronwyn complained, but they were gone. Cheryl rolled over onto her stomach. "It must be awful," she said, not looking up from her comic, "to be dumped with your brother like this all the time." A spadeful of sand flew through the air, showering Cheryl's back. "You disgusting little brat," she flashed at Sampson. "It is only sand, you know, Cheryl," Bronwyn said as she gathered her little brother up in her arms, "and he's no more a brat than you're a brat." She stalked off towards the water's edge. "No more a brat than you're a brat," Cheryl mimicked. "No more a brat." But Bronwyn and Sampson were already out of earshot and were digging in the wet, soft sand at the water's edge. "Pond, Bronny," the little boy said excitedly. They were so engrossed in reinforcing the crumbling walls of Sampson's pond that they didn't notice Dad emerge from the water and run up the beach to where Cheryl lay under the umbrella. But Bronwyn certainly noticed Dad enter the waves again with Cheryl clinging to his arm. "Oh goody, right out the back where the big waves are," she called out as she passed. Bronwyn, disengaging herself from Sampson, stood up and watched them disappearing into the waves, stabbed by jealousy. Dad always took her out the back immediately they arrived at the beach, and yet there was Cheryl screaming with delight and leaping all over her father. It was too much being left here like this. She glanced down at her little brother and was filled with a sudden anger. "Come on," she grabbed at his hand roughly and pulled him away from the pond at the water's edge. "Pond, Bron," he shrieked, but she yanked him back up the beach towards their umbrella, ignoring his frantic cries. "Pond, pond!" She grabbed the bright yellow plastic spade and slapped it in his small hands. "You want a pond? Okay, you build one right here. Look, see?" And she began forming a hole in the sand. "You build it and just leave me alone." She flung herself unhappily onto a towel, choking back tears. How she wished that Cheryl might dive under a wave out in the deep and come face to face with a shark that would snap her right up. "Water, Bronny," Sampson insisted once again, interrupting Bronwyn's sinister thoughts. He had scooped up the bucket and was toddling off towards the surf. "Yes, Sammy, bring back the water," she stared absently as he toddled down past the flagpole. Well, perhaps forget the shark bit, Bronwyn reflected, but if only Cheryl would just leave them all in peace. Though it wouldn't exactly be peace with Sampson around, she thought bitterly, not exactly peaceful. She could see Sampson now threading his way expertly around the reclining figures on the sand, not spilling a drop of the precious water in his bucket. Sometimes it was just nice to think of the house without Sampson too. Just Mum and Dad and plenty of time to talk to each other again. Sampson was sweet, but... "Here, Bron," he interrupted her thoughts while emptying the water into the hastily dug hole. "Yes, that's it, Sam," she agreed. "Get more water, Sam, plenty of water." She was glad to turn away from him and sprawl on the towel with Cheryl's comic blocking out the world. She didn't even look up when Cheryl and Dad emerged from the water. "Oh, that was wonderful," Cheryl gushed. "It's absolutely super out there." "I thought you only liked pools," Bronwyn muttered. "Where's Sampson?" Dad asked at once as he stooped for his towel. "Oh, just down there somewhere, filling his bucket." "I didn't see him as we came out." "Well, he is there," Bronwyn said crossly. "You'd better point him out, Lovey. There's an awful lot of people on this beach." Bronwyn threw down the comic angrily. "I can't even read something without somebody interrupting. Look out for Sampson, look out for Sampson. That's all I ever seem to hear. Who looks out for me?" she exploded. "What's wrong with her?" Cheryl asked, but Dad didn't answer. He was scanning the crowd all along the strip of sand between the flagpoles and was beginning to look anxious. "Bronwyn, I think you'd better walk down with me and point out just exactly where you think your little brother is," he said quietly, "because I can't see any sign of him." Bronwyn jumped to her feet and she and Dad went down to the flagpoles, but there was no Sampson now. "He was right here a minute ago," Bronwyn said, anxious now herself. She pointed helplessly to the spot, but Sampson was nowhere in sight. Deborah and Mum came out of the surf at that moment. "What is it?" Mum asked, sensing at once that something was wrong. "Sampson's wandered away. He was filling his bucket with water last time Bron saw him. He must have lost his way trying to get back. He's got to be here somewhere." Dad tried to sound cheery. They organised themselves quickly to cover the whole beach. Mum and Deb set off to the south while Dad struck out to the north. "You two girls go up to the promenade and the swings," Mum directed as Cheryl joined them. Dad must have noticed Bronwyn's miserable face, for he took the time to say, "It'll be okay, Bron. He probably headed to the ice cream parlour. We'll find him for sure." "What about the water, John?" Mum asked. "Who's checking the water?" Her voice sounded strange, dull and lifeless. "He'd never go into deep water, Mum," Bronwyn said at once. "He's too scared of the big waves." "There's always a first time," Cheryl said gloomily. "He wouldn't have gone into the water," Dad said firmly. "Now we'd better all get on with it. Meet back here in 5 minutes, okay?" They went their separate ways. Bronwyn moving swiftly up the broad concrete promenade with Cheryl beside her. They looked among the parked cars and the chairs and tables in front of the ice cream parlour. They looked in the playground beside the pavilion, but Sampson was nowhere to be seen. Bronwyn felt as if her heart were thumping louder and stronger as the minutes flew by. Her eyes darted quickly from child to child, and her breath stopped short each time she caught sight of blue bathers. But there was no sign of Sampson. In her mind's eye, she could see him, the chubby little face smiling at the idea of the pond he was making, and she could hear again the thoughts she'd had as if they'd been shouted aloud for all to hear. A house without Sampson. She'd wished for a house without Sampson. Suddenly, she could not bear to think of a house without Sampson, a beach without Sampson, a day or a minute or a second without Sampson. She must find him. She must find him now. She sped away along the promenade in a burst of energy. "Hey, Bronwyn, where are you going? Your dad said to go back in 5... She sped away from the voice and away from all the dreadful places empty of Sampson. She darted down the stairs and onto the sand, running wildly, searching for him, kicking sand and knocking into umbrellas. Bronwyn knew she couldn't possibly return to her parents without Sampson. Red in the face and panting now, she reached the end of the beach, but there was still no Sampson to be seen. She leaned against a high rock, breathing heavily. She felt a terrible pain in her chest, and it seemed that her whole life flashed in front of her in a moment. Her whole life, and it was without Sampson now. She had lost him. There was no getting away from the fact. She had lost him. She would have to return empty-handed to her parents. She would have to see their eyes big and afraid. She would have to wait with them there in the sun with the lifesavers and police, wait for something to happen or not to happen. She would have to endure the gaping silences as they all waited and waited. "Bronwyn! Bronwyn!" Cheryl was approaching, gasping for air. "I couldn't keep up. You ran so fast." She bent over, holding her stomach. "Such a stitch," she gasped. "I've an idea. Sampson." What idea? Where?" Bronwyn leapt from the rock. She wanted to shake the panting, heaving girl like a rat and scream in her face. "What idea? Where? Where might he be?" Instead, she waited as Cheryl caught her breath and at last stood upright. "He was so mad about the little rock pool this morning, remember? He kept turning round and trying to get back to it. Well, you wouldn't be able to see him there unless you went right past the baths, down the steps and across the rocks. I'll bet that's where he's gone." Bronwyn didn't answer, just pushed past Cheryl and darted the short distance to the sea baths, running along the high, slippery concrete edge. Again, she heard her heart beating urgently, but this time it was with hope, not despair. "Oh, please," she prayed silently. "Oh, please let him be by the small rock pool. Let him be there safe and sound. Cheryl can stay in our house forever and I'll never complain again. Only let him be there." Bronwyn had reached the end of the baths. She stopped at the top of the slippery stairs and glanced down, hopefully, fearfully, but the rock pool was empty. Only a yellow spade floated on its surface. No one was in it or beside it. In fact, there was no one inside on the rock platform at all. She turned away, tears of bitter disappointment in her eyes, and stumbled a few steps past figures poised to dive into the pool. Then she stopped dead. She turned and ran back, leapt down the high wall to the rock platform and small pool. It was Sampson's yellow plastic spade floating there in the water. She was sure of it. If his spade was here, then he must be here somewhere too. Here on the rock shelf, somewhere close by. It was the blue bathers she saw first, just a glimpse of bright colour against the massive concrete wall of the pool, and there he was, tiny and helpless, huddled behind the concrete pillar. He had his fists in his eyes and he was crying and shivering despite the sun. "Oh, Sampson!" She leapt upon her little brother, covering him with kisses and tears. "Sampson, Sampson, what on earth are you doing here all alone?" "I lost," he said, clinging to her now, his arms and legs wound round her body. "I lost, Bronnie." Bronwyn glanced up and saw Cheryl's face, blotchy red, but smiling now, over the high wall of the baths. "Hey," she cried, "you found the little brat, did you?" Bronwyn smiled up at Cheryl, gloriously happy now. "Go and tell them," Bronwyn yelled, indicating the world with a sweep of her arm. Cheryl understood at once, and the face withdrew before Bronwyn could add, "And run, Cheryl, run!" Bronwyn turned back toward the stairs with the precious burden of her brother in her arms. She carried him ever so carefully up the stairs and around the pool, but when she reached the sand, she began to run with Sampson, heavy and awkward in her arms. She ran because she could see her parents away in the distance, through the crowd, and they were running too. They met halfway along the beach, 6 of them, and a few lifesavers in tow, who left abruptly with smiles and a few cheery words. "Here he is, safe and sound, the little fellow. Knew he'd be okay." Both Mum and Dad looked teary-eyed as they hugged first Sampson, then Bronwyn, then Cheryl, and then Sampson again. "I lost," he kept crying excitedly, pleased with all the fuss. "You found," Dad insisted. "Where was he?" they all asked at once. "It was Cheryl who thought of the rock pool," Bronwyn said generously. "Feel free to take all the glory, Bronwyn. You're the one who actually found him," Cheryl said quickly. "Of course," she went on, "you were the one who lost him in the first place." Mum threw her arms around both girls. "You're both terribly clever," she said. For once, Cheryl didn't disagree. When they reached their umbrella, they all sank onto the towels in relief. All of them, that is, except Cheryl. She remained standing, one hand on her hip, staring accusingly at the group. "I'm revoltingly hot," she complained. "I knew very well we'd find that child, running like mad things, and now I'm so hot and dry." "I'll never let him out of my sight again," Bronwyn promised her parents. "We'll not be letting him out of our sight," Dad corrected her. "Yes," Mum agreed. "I think because you've looked after Sampson so well in the past, I've just expected more and more of you." And she smiled at Bronwyn as if to say she understood exactly what Bronwyn had been feeling, and Bronwyn smiled back. "Who'll look after him then?" Cheryl demanded. "I hope you don't think I will." You won't be able to, Deborah told her. We're moving into our new flat next week. Well, Cheryl said, slowly sinking down beside Sampson and tickling his tummy. I wouldn't mind looking after him sometimes. He is rather sweet, even if he does wear nappies. Ice cream, Sampson crooned, looking hopeful. Yes, ice creams all round, Dad agreed. Bronwyn, why don't you take your friend Cheryl up to the ice cream parlour and bring back ice creams for everyone? And when they're digested, I'll take you out the back to the big waves, just the two of us. All the world seemed right now, with Sampson safe and sound. Bronwyn didn't even mind Cheryl being described as her friend. Cheryl wasn't that bad. Cheryl and Bronwyn struck out across the sand. Why are you smiling like that? Cheryl asked crossly. You look so dumb. I can hardly find a thing to smile about here. All this sand and sun. The ice creams will melt, you know. Back home we have trees on our beaches, and you can lie under them on grass in the cool, and the ice creams don't melt at all. Bronwyn began giggling wildly. What's so funny? Cheryl demanded. You, she announced. Look, Cheryl, I don't want to hear another word about your ice creams or anything else back home either. Ice creams here are big and gooey and sticky, and they run down your arm and drip everywhere. However, I am buying a messy, disgusting ice cream for everyone and a double header for Sampson. Now, do you want one? Cheryl sighed. I know I won't enjoy it one little bit, but I suppose I'll just have to have one of your disgusting ice creams, she said as they approached the counter. In fact, you can make mine a double header too. Thanks for reading the story with me, girls and boys. I hope you enjoyed it.